He held her by the waist, and the world stood still. "Won't you tell me your name?" Arthur asked, his voice a husky whisper amidst the music. Her eyes, startled, met his. I shouldn't be here, sir," Elisa stammered, her heart hammering wildly. He smiled wryly. "Too late for that. Now tell me, why do you tremble so? Is it from fear or from anger?" Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The autumn night air in Blackwood Downs carried a chill that nipped at the skin. But inside the great hall of Lord Arthur Blackwood's manor house, the heat was almost suffocating. It came from the dozens of candles burning in silver candelabras, from the warmth of bodies pressed close, and most of all, from the vanity emanating from each guest. Lights danced on the tall, floor-to-ceiling mirrors, creating the illusion of an infinite space, a labyrinth of luxury where calculated smiles and glances multiplied. On the mezzanine, a small orchestra played waltzes that seemed distant, like the soundtrack to a dream that didn't belong to everyone there. The perfume was a dense mixture of melted beeswax, white lilies, and the imported fragrance ladies sprayed on their fans. At the center of it all, yet apart, stood the Lord. Arthur observed the scene with an immobility that bordered on indifference. His hands were clasped firmly behind his back, his black velvet suit impeccable, his face sculpted by a seriousness few dared to challenge. His eyes, a bluish gray that changed color with the light, seemed to register every detail with almost inhuman precision. He saw the gestures, the whispers, the veiled interests. He saw everything, but felt nothing. He was the host of a party he didn't want to give, the center of attention he didn't wish to have. It was into this setting that Elisa arrived. She had walked along the dirt track that snaked through the valley fields, a path she knew by heart, but which tonight seemed longer and more intimidating. The dress she wore was her best, though it spoke volumes about her life. The fabric, a simple linen, was already worn by time and washing, its original color lost in an undefined shade between brown and beige. But it was clean, pressed with a charcoal iron, and the stitching, done by her own hands, was firm. The neckline was high and modest, as befitted a young woman of her station. Daughter of tenant farmers, she lived alone with her mother, whom a stubborn fever had left bedridden and frail. The fatigue of long days in the fields was etched on her face, and her hands, calloused from the hoe handle, were a map of her daily struggle. Her entrance was a dissonant note in the symphony of opulence. Eyes turned to her like sharp knives. The ladies, in their satin and taffeta gowns, turned up their noses with discreet elegance. The young gentlemen, gathered near the drinks tables, stifled their laughter behind their hands. For a second, the orchestra seemed to stumble on a note, a musical hiccup that marked her arrival. The first humiliation was silent, but cutting. The footman at the entrance, a man of rigid posture and white gloves, eyed her invitation with suspicion. It was a simple piece of paper, unlike the embossed, gilded cards of the other guests, but the handwriting was the Lord's own, and the wax seal unmistakable. Still, the man hesitated. "Are you certain, miss, that this invitation is for tonight?" he asked, his voice laden with wounding disdain. Elisa merely lifted her chin. Her large brown eyes met his gaze with a firmness that disarmed him. "I am," she said, her voice low but clear. The footman finally made way, but did so with an abrupt gesture, as if shooing away an unwanted animal. Inside, the noise and brilliance assaulted her. Elisa walked slowly, with uncertain steps, the polished floor seeming dangerously slick beneath her worn boots. She sought a corner, a shadow, any place where she could blend in with the decor and disappear. But she quickly learned that in a ballroom where everyone vied for attention, simplicity was the loudest costume of all. She leaned against one of the marble columns supporting the mezzanine, feeling the cold of the stone through the thin fabric of her dress. From there, she observed the swirl of colors and sounds, feeling like a spectator in a world to which she would never belong. The invitation in her pocket seemed to burn. It had been a surprise. It had been a surprise. The Lord's messenger had delivered it that morning, saying it was in thanks for the basket of medicinal herbs she had left in the manor house kitchen to help one of the cooks with a persistent cough. A gesture of kindness she made expecting nothing in return, and which now placed her in this terrible situation. Meanwhile, across the ballroom, Arthur continued his vigil. A group of nobles surrounded him, speaking of the usual, the next harvest, the price of thoroughbred horses, a rumor about a new tax the county government intended to create. He responded in monosyllables, his mind far away. A widower for 3 years, he lived in a state of perpetual mourning, not so much for his wife, with whom he had had a marriage of convenience, but for the peace his widowhood had brought him, a peace everyone now wanted to disturb. This ball, which everyone called the Great Autumn Ball, was in truth a market. The most important families in the region had brought their marriageable daughters as one would display the finest harvest. But to Arthur, they were all the same, with their rehearsed smiles and empty chatter. The silence between the songs told him more than any words they could utter. He was already determined to end the party early when his eyes fell upon the motionless figure by the column. And for the first time that night, something captured his attention. Arthur observed the young woman across the ballroom. At first, it was merely fleeting curiosity. He saw her enter, noticed the footman's hesitation, and the thinly veiled contempt in the man's gesture. He saw the cutting glances of the other women and the snickers of the young men. It was a subtle cruelty, that society's preferred weapon. He knew that poison well. But what intrigued him was not the humiliation she suffered, but the way she endured it. There were no tears in her eyes, no anger in her posture. There was a silent dignity, a strength that seemed to blossom from within, like a solitary tree refusing to bend with the wind. She simply leaned against the column and stood there, quiet, as if she had created an invisible refuge around herself. At that instant, the second humiliation came, this time more direct. Victoria Beaumont, the mayor's daughter, a young woman whose beauty was surpassed only by her arrogance, glided across the ballroom in her scarlet velvet gown. She was the most obvious candidate for the post of New Lady Blackwood, and acted as if the title were already hers. With a smile that didn't reach her eyes, she approached Elisa. "What admirable courage," Victoria said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "It takes a great deal to come to an event like this with such an unadorned presentation. It shows you have a strong spirit." The ladies accompanying her exchanged glances and stifled giggles behind their fans. The word unadorned sounded like an insult. Elisa felt the blood rush to her face, a wave of heat that made her feel dizzy. She looked at her own hands, at the calluses and short nails, and then at Victoria's hands, with perfectly polished nails and ruby rings. For a moment, she wanted to reply, to say something that would wipe that smug smile from the other's face. But the words wouldn't come. She simply took a deep breath, trying to control the tremor threatening to take hold of her fingers. The orchestra announced the start of a new dance, a lively polka. It was the final blow, the third and cruelest of the humiliations. As if on cue, all the gentlemen rushed to ask ladies to dance. Pairs formed in the blink of an eye, and the center of the ballroom filled with swirling gowns and dark tailcoats. In a matter of seconds, an empty space formed around Elisa. She was the only woman without a partner, the only static figure amidst the movement. leaning against the column. She was the image of solitude. The vibrant sound of the violin now seemed to mock her, and the candelabra's glow seemed to purposely illuminate her exclusion. It was as if an invisible wall separated her from everyone else. From the top of the small staircase leading to his study, Arthur saw everything. Victoria's approach, the malice disguised as praise, the way Elisa blushed but didn't flinch, and finally, the deliberate abandonment when the music began. That scene awakened something dormant within him, an old memory of himself, of a time before the title, before the inherited wealth, when he was just a young cadet at the military academy, ridiculed for his country accent and his unrefined manners. He knew the bitter taste of that kind of loneliness, and something in the silent resilience of that young woman touched him in a way none of the well-dressed, well-spoken ladies ever could. Without thinking, he began to descend the steps. His steps were slow, deliberate, and the sound of his leather boots on the polished wooden floor echoed through the ballroom. One by one, the dancing couples slowed their pace. Side conversations ceased. The musicians, sensing the sudden change in atmosphere, lowered the volume of their instruments until the music became a mere whisper. The only clear sound was the Lord's footsteps. All eyes turned to him, curious, apprehensive. No one understood what was happening. Arthur crossed the empty ballroom, the sea of people parting at his passage. He looked at no one. His eyes were fixed on the young woman leaning against the column. Elisa, noticing the silence and the movement toward her, raised her face. Her eyes met his, and she felt a shiver. What did he want? Had he come to personally cast her out? Panic began to bubble in her chest. He stopped directly in front of her. He was even taller than he seemed from afar. His shadow enveloped her, and for an instant, she felt even smaller, more insignificant. Arthur said not a single word. The silence stretched, dense and heavy. Then, slowly, he extended his hand to her. His gloved hand, pale, contrasting with the darkness of his tailcoat. The gesture was simple, unequivocal. An invitation. The entire ballroom held its breath. The shock was palpable. Victoria Beaumont, who watched closely, turned pale. Her lips pursed into a thin line of fury. The other ladies exchanged incredulous glances, some of astonishment, others of pure disdain. How dared he invite that woman to dance? Elisa hesitated. Her mind reeled. This couldn't be real. It must be another trick, a more elaborate way to humiliate her in front of everyone. She looked at the extended hand and then at his face. Arthur's expression was indecipherable, but there was no mockery in his eyes. There was seriousness and a patience that seemed infinite. He kept his arm outstretched, motionless, waiting. Elisa's heart beat so loudly she feared everyone could hear it. She thought of her mother, of her simple cottage. Slowly, with a trembling hand, she placed hers in his. The sensation of his glove's soft leather against her rough, calloused skin was a shock. It was the fourth turning point of the night. The ballroom watched, astonished, at that contrast that was almost an affront. The velvet of his tailcoat against the rough linen of her dress, the gleam of the signet ring on his finger against the worn sleeve of her garment. At a nod from the Lord, the orchestra began to play again. This time a slow, solemn waltz. Arthur led her to the center of the ballroom. His firm hand on her back guided her, and she let herself be led, her feet moving almost by instinct. They danced. It wasn't a perfect dance. Elisa didn't know the steps with the same fluidity as the other ladies, and Arthur wasn't the most enthusiastic of dancers. But there was a different harmony between them, something that came not from technique, but from a silent and unexpected connection. His eyes never left hers, and hers, initially frightened, gradually lost themselves in that bluish-gray gaze, finding a calm she hadn't expected. For Elisa, the rest of the ballroom vanished. The lights, the stairs, the whispers, everything dissolved. There was only the music and this man who, for some inexplicable reason, had chosen her. When the last chords of the waltz faded into the air, Arthur and Elisa stopped in the center of the ballroom. For an instant, the silence was absolute. Then, timid, scattered applause began to ripple, uncertain, as if the guests didn't know how to react to such an unusual scene. Ignoring everyone, Arthur bowed with unexpected solemnity and kissed Elisa's hand. It wasn't a quick, perfunctory kiss, but a lingering, respectful gesture. That simple act, witnessed by the entire elite of the region, was like a stone thrown into still waters. The shockwaves spread instantly. The gesture stripped away masks. Many of the young men who had laughed at her now felt a pang of shame. The ladies, who had previously looked at her with disdain, suddenly changed their attitude. Hasty pretense took the place of mockery. "What a charming young woman," one lady commented to her neighbor, loud enough for others to hear. Such captivating simplicity. Victoria Beaumont watched from afar, her face a mask of contained fury. The humiliation she had tried to inflict on Elisa had turned back on herself. The Lord had ignored her all night to dance with a nobody. The affront was public, and the taste of defeat was bitter. Elisa felt her face burn, but this time it wasn't from shame. It was a mixture of confusion, gratitude, and a growing fear. What did all this mean? Arthur accompanied her back to the column where he had found her. "Thank you for the dance," he said, his voice low and formal. But his eyes said something more, something she couldn't decipher. Without waiting for a reply, he turned and ascended the staircase, disappearing into his private chambers and leaving behind a ballroom in an uproar. The party, for him, was over. For Elisa, the night was just beginning, in a way she could never have imagined. She didn't stay long, feeling all eyes on her, now laden with a curiosity almost as uncomfortable as the disdain from before. She slipped out and began the long walk back home, under a starry sky that seemed as confused as her heart. The next day, the story of the ball was already running wild throughout the county. Rumors spread faster than the wind, each more fanciful than the last. They said the Lord had finally gone mad from loneliness. Others swore the peasant girl was a witch who had enchanted him with some ancient country spell. The more cynical claimed it was all a calculated provocation by Arthur to the local gentry, a way to show he wouldn't bow to their expectations. No one, of course, considered the simplest possibility, a gesture of pure and simple compassion. At the Beaumont estate, breakfast was tense. Colonel Alistair Beaumont, the mayor and most powerful man in the region after the Lord, read the newspaper with a frown, but his attention was on his daughter. Victoria had barely touched her food, her gaze lost out the window, her face pale with rage. "Stop brooding over it, my dear," the colonel said, folding the newspaper with a thud on the table. "Arthur has always been eccentric. It was a whim, nothing more." "A whim that humiliated me in front of everyone, Papa," she retorted, her voice trembling. "He made a fool of me." "No one is calling you a fool," he said, impatient. "But you need to be smarter. This union between our families is too important to be ruined by some peasant girl. The Lord needs a wife, and his lands, combined with ours, would make us the owners of this valley. I won't let a nobody ruin my plans. We'll find a way." While the powerful schemed, Arthur, in his library, made a decision. The image of the young woman wouldn't leave his head. Her silent strength, her lack of artifice. He felt curious. He wanted to know more about her. He called his trusted butler, Mr. Jenkins, an elderly gentleman with white hair who had served his family since before he was born. "Jenkins, I want you to find out where the young woman from the ball yesterday lives." The "The girl in the simple dress," Arthur said, feeling a little strange giving the order. "And I want you to send her this." He pointed to a basket he had already ordered prepared in the kitchen. Inside, there was fresh bread, cheeses, a bottle of wine, and a jar of homemade jam. "Tell her it's a thank you for the dance." Mr. Jenkins, who knew his master like the back of his hand, raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He simply nodded. "As you wish, my lord." He saw the curiosity in Arthur's eyes, but he also saw the danger. He knew well the malice of the people in the region and feared for the young woman. The basket arrived at Elisa's cottage in the middle of the afternoon. She was in the yard, hanging washed clothes on the line, when the Lord's messenger appeared. Upon seeing the Blackwood family crest and the contents of the basket, Elisa froze. It was more food than she and her mother saw in a month. Her first reaction was to refuse. It was too much. It was embarrassing. But the messenger insisted, saying they were direct orders from the Lord. When he left, Elisa carried the basket inside, her heart pounding. Her mother, lying in bed, looked at the bounty with wide eyes. "My daughter, what is this?" she asked, her voice weak. Elisa stumbled through the story of the previous night. Her mother listened in silence, an expression of concern growing on her face. "Be careful, my child," she said at the end. "Their world is not ours. Their kindness often comes with a price." Her mother's words echoed in Elisa's mind. She couldn't accept such an expensive gift without, at the very least, thanking him personally. And, more than that, she needed to understand. Why? Why had he done that? She felt she owed an explanation not to him, but to herself. The next day, very early, she took the now empty basket and walked to the manor house. Her plan was simple: hand it to the footman at the gate, leave a thank you message, and leave before anyone saw her. She wanted no more trouble, but fate, or perhaps the Lord himself, had other plans. When she arrived at the imposing iron gate, embarrassed, holding the basket as if it were proof of her inferiority, Arthur himself was in the garden, pruning his rose bushes. He saw her approach and put down his gardening shears. With the same calm as the previous night, he walked to the gate. "Good morning," he said, his voice tranquil. "Have you come to return the basket? I hope you enjoyed what was inside." Elisa blushed violently. "Good morning, my lord. Yes, we enjoyed it very much. It was very kind of you. I didn't need to." She fumbled with her words, feeling small under his gaze. "I only came to thank you and return it." "Nonsense," he said, opening the gate. "Come in, please. Would you care for a glass of water? The walk here is long." The invitation caught her by surprise. Go inside? Into the manor house? Through the front gate? The idea terrified her, but to refuse would be an offense. With her heart in her throat, she stepped inside. Elisa entered the manor house gardens as one steps on sacred ground. The contrast with her own yard, where chickens scratched at the dirt, was stark. Here, the grass was a perfectly manicured green carpet, and the flower beds exploded in vibrant colors of roses, dahlias, and lavenders, all arranged with an almost unnatural precision. The air was fragrant and silent, except for the buzzing of bees and the soft sound of a stone fountain hidden among the trees. She held the empty basket against her chest, a fragile shield against all that grandeur. Arthur led her to a small white iron bench in the shade of a leafy ancient oak. He didn't invite her inside the house, a gesture that she, in her sensitivity, understood as a form of delicacy, to not intimidate her further. "Please sit," he said, indicating the bench. He himself remained standing, leaning against the tree trunk, a respectful distance between them. The silence that settled was different from the tense silence of the ball. It was a calm, expectant silence. It was he who broke it. "I wanted to apologize," he began, and Elisa looked at him surprised. "For the behavior of my guests. They are not always a reflection of what I would like this house to represent. You don't need to apologize for them, she replied, her voice little more than a whisper. I shouldn't have gone. My place isn't there. And what is your place? He asked, his curiosity genuine. The question disarmed her. No one had ever asked her something like that. People simply assumed what her place was. My place is with my mother, tending our patch of land, our home. Your mother isn't well, I heard, he commented, carefully. The cook told me about the herbs you brought, said the tea worked wonders for her cough. It's just a fever that won't pass, Elisa said, looking at her own hands resting in her lap. The village doctor says it's fatigue, that she needs rest and good food. But rest and good food are luxuries for us. There was a contained bitterness in her words, but no self-pity. Arthur noticed this. He was accustomed to people who complained, who asked, who insinuated. She merely stated a fact with the same naturalness with which she would speak of the weather. Do you manage everything alone? He wanted to know. The house, the fields, your mother? She nodded. It's not so difficult. The soil is good, and I learned to work it from a young age with my father. Your father passed away many years ago, she completed, without drama. A snake bite in the middle of the cornfield. It was quick. They talked for long minutes, perhaps almost an hour. He asked about the countryside, about the cycles of planting and harvesting, about the difference between the wheat of the lowlands and that of the hills, about the loneliness of long days. And she, who was normally so reserved, found herself answering. She spoke little, with short, direct sentences, but with a truth that Arthur didn't find in any of the conversations of his social circle. She didn't try to impress him, didn't measure her words, didn't seek to please. She simply was. From his upstairs window, Mr. Jenkins observed the scene with a mixture of apprehension and astonishment. He saw his master, a man who barely exchanged 2 words with the most important nobles, conversing animatedly with a simple peasant girl. He saw Arthur's rigid posture relax, saw an interest in his eyes he hadn't seen in years, since before the death of his first wife. Jenkins smelled trouble brewing. He knew this wouldn't end well. Their society did not forgive deviations. It was there, in the shade of that ancient oak, that the 5th turning point occurred, not in the external world, but within the Lord himself. Arthur realized with terrifying clarity what truly bothered him in his life. It wasn't his widowhood or the responsibility of his title. It was the noise, the constant noise of others' expectations, of futile conversations, of petty intrigues, of the noisy solitude of his existence. And in that young woman, in her low voice and serene gaze, he found silence. Not the empty silence of his corridors, but a silence full of peace, of strength, of authenticity. He realized he wasn't looking for a new wife to adorn his name or manage his household. He was looking for someone whose presence would restore him to himself. And Elisa, for the first time in her life, felt seen. Not as the farmer's daughter, not as the poor girl from the valley, not as an object of pity or scorn. This powerful man, who could have any woman he wished, was there, in front of her, and lowered his voice to listen to her. He didn't look down on her, but as an equal, and in bluish-gray eyes, she didn't see the Lord, but just a man who seemed as lonely as she. When the sun began to grow stronger, she stood up. I need to go. My mother will worry, she said, adjusting her dress. Thank you again for the gift, sir, and for the conversation. I should be thanking you, Arthur said, and there was a sincerity in his voice that made her blush. May I ask your name? On the night of the ball, I didn't have the chance. Elisa, she replied. Elisa Davies. Elisa, he repeated, as if savoring the sound. I will escort you to the gate. When she left, leaving behind only the trace of her footsteps on the gravel path, Arthur remained standing, watching the path where she had disappeared. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the seed of hope, But, like an experienced farmer, he also knew that every seed needs to face the elements to sprout. And the storm, he was certain, would not be long in coming. News of Elisa's visit to the manor house spread like wildfire. Rumors flew faster than the wind, each more fantastical than the last. They said the Lord had finally gone mad with loneliness. Others swore the peasant girl was a witch who had enchanted him with some ancient country spell. The most cynical claimed it was all a calculated provocation by Arthur to the local gentry, a way of showing he wouldn't bow to their expectations. No one, of course, considered the simplest possibility, a gesture of pure and simple compassion. At the Beaumont estate, breakfast was tense. Colonel Alistair Beaumont, the mayor and most powerful man in the region after the Lord, read the newspaper with a frown, but his attention was on his daughter. Victoria had barely touched her food, her gaze lost out the window, her face pale with rage. "Stop brooding over it, my dear," the colonel said, folding the newspaper with a thud on the table. "Arthur has always been eccentric. It was a whim, nothing more." "A whim that humiliated me in front of everyone, Papa," she retorted, her voice trembling. "He made a fool of me." "No one is calling you a fool," he said, impatient. "But you need to be smarter. This union between our families is too important to be ruined by some peasant girl. The Lord needs a wife, and his lands, combined with ours, would make us the owners of this valley. I won't let a nobody ruin my plans. We'll find a way." While the powerful schemed, Arthur, in his library, made a decision. The image of the young woman wouldn't leave his head. Her silent strength, her lack of artifice. He felt curious. He wanted to know more about her. He called his trusted butler, Mr. Jenkins, an elderly gentleman with white hair who had served his family since before he was born. "Jenkins, I want you to find out where the young woman from the ball yesterday lives. The girl in the simple dress," Arthur said, feeling a little strange giving the order. "And I want you to send her this." He pointed to a basket he had already ordered prepared in the kitchen. Inside, there was fresh bread, cheeses, a bottle of wine, and a jar of homemade jam. "Tell her it's a thank you for the dance." Mr. Jenkins, who knew his master like the back of his hand, raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He simply nodded. "As you wish, my lord." He saw the curiosity in Arthur's eyes, but he also saw the danger. He knew well the malice of the people in the region, and feared for the young woman. The basket arrived at Elisa's cottage in the middle of the afternoon. She was in the yard, hanging washed clothes on the line, when the Lord's messenger appeared. Upon seeing the Blackwood family crest and the contents of the basket, Elisa froze. It was more food than she and her mother saw in a month. Her first reaction was to refuse. It was too much. It was embarrassing. But the messenger insisted, saying they were direct orders from the Lord. When he left, Elisa carried the basket inside, her heart pounding. Her mother, lying in bed, looked at the bounty with wide eyes. "My daughter, what is this?" she asked, her voice weak. Elisa stumbled through the story of the previous night. Her mother listened in silence, an expression of concern growing on her face. "Be careful, my child," she said at the end. "Their world is not ours. Their kindness often comes with a price." Her mother's words echoed in Elisa's mind. She couldn't accept such an expensive gift without, at the very least, thanking him personally. And more than that, she needed to understand. Why? Why had he done that? She felt she owed an explanation, not to him, but to herself. The next day, very early, she took the now empty basket and walked to the manor house. Her plan was simple. Hand it to the footman at the gate, leave a thank you message, and leave before anyone saw her. She wanted no more trouble. But fate, or perhaps the Lord himself, had other plans. When she arrived at the imposing iron gate, embarrassed, holding the basket as if it were proof of her inferiority, Arthur himself was in the garden, pruning his rose bushes. He saw her approach and put down his gardening shears. With the same calm as the previous night, he walked to the gate. "Good morning," he said, his voice tranquil. "Have you come to return the basket? I hope you enjoyed what was inside." Elisa blushed violently. "Good morning, my lord. Yes, we enjoyed it very much. It was very kind of you. I didn't need to untame." She fumbled with her words, feeling small under his gaze. "I only came to thank you and return it." "Nonsense," he said, opening the gate. "Come in, please. Would you care for a glass of water? The walk here is long." The invitation caught her by surprise. Go inside? Into the manor house? Through the front gate? The idea terrified her, but to refuse would be an offense. With her heart in her throat, she stepped inside. The days that followed were marked by growing tension. Victoria's visit left Elisa on high alert. She realized that the Lord's kindness had brought her a kind of attention she didn't want, placing her at the center of a power struggle and vanity that wasn't hers. Fear began to settle in her heart, a fear that the fury of those wealthy people might splash onto her mother, her home, her already fragile life. She closed herself off even more, avoiding going to the village and focusing on her work in the fields, trying to find in the earth the peace that the world of men denied her. Arthur, for his part, felt the pressure mounting. Colonel Beaumont moved his pieces on the region's social chessboard. Subtly, he spread rumors that the Lord was losing his mind, that his reclusion had made him eccentric and unpredictable. Longtime friends of his father began to visit him more frequently, with conversations that invariably ended in advice about the necessity of a good marriage to put his house in order. Arthur received them with politeness, but inwardly his anger and weariness grew. He felt increasingly like a prisoner in his own home, surrounded by vultures disguised as friends. The forced distance between him and Elisa only increased his desire to see her again. It wasn't an overwhelming passion, but a need for her presence, her calm, her truth. He needed to hear her speak about simple things, real things. To remind himself that a world existed beyond the walls of his library and the intrigues of the ballroom. He decided he could wait no longer. He needed to see her, but he knew that another visit from her to the manor house or from him to her cottage would only fuel more gossip. It had to be in a neutral place, away from all eyes. He wrote a short note and sent it by one of his most trusted servants, a young lad who lived near Elisa's cottage. The note simply said, "I need to speak with you. Meet me tomorrow at sunrise near the ancient oak by the river. A." The lad handed the note to Elisa discreetly when she was returning from the spring with a bucket of water. Elisa read the note with a pounding heart. Part of her said not to go, to ignore it. It was dangerous, imprudent. But another, stronger part felt she had to go. This meeting seemed important, a chance to understand what was happening, or perhaps just to feel again that sense of peace that their conversation had brought her. That night, she barely slept, her mind torn between fear and anticipation. Before the first rays of sun painted the sky, she was already awake. She left the house in silence so as not to wake her mother, and walked along the misty path that led to the river. The ancient oak was a landmark in the region, a gigantic ancient tree whose roots seemed like claws gripping the earth. When she arrived, he was already there, leaning against the trunk, looking at the dark, tranquil waters of the river. He wasn't wearing formal lord's clothes, but simple trousers and a white linen shirt, looking more like a farmer than a noble. "You came," he said, with a relieved smile. "I was afraid you wouldn't." "I was afraid too," she admitted, stopping a small distance away. "People are talking, sir. Your friend, the mayor's daughter, came to visit me." Arthur's smile vanished. "What did she say to you?" Elisa recounted the visit, about the veiled threats disguised as advice. Arthur clenched his fists. "Victoria can be cruel when she feels thwarted. I'm so sorry she bothered you." "It wasn't your fault," Elisa said. But I need to understand. Why are you doing this? Inviting me to dance? Receiving me at your house? What do you want from me?" The question hung in the air, direct and honest. Arthur looked at her and saw the vulnerability in her eyes, but also the strength that impelled her to seek the truth. He moved away from the tree trunk and approached her. "I don't know if I have a simple answer, Elisa," he began, his voice grave. "Since my wife died, I have lived in a world of shadows, fulfilling obligations, following empty rituals. And then, that night, at the ball, I saw you. And I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. I saw truth, without masks, without games. And when we talked in the garden, I was certain. Your presence does me good. It reminds me of who I was before I became this." He made a vague gesture, encompassing the idea of the title, the wealth, the loneliness. His words touched her deeply. He wasn't talking about beauty or charm. He was talking about something in her soul. "I also felt good talking to you, sir," she confessed in a low voice. "For the first time, someone listened to me without judging me." They stayed there, talking, as the sun rose and the mist dissipated, revealing the lush green banks of the river. They spoke of their dreams and their fears. Elisa spoke of her desire to see her mother cured, and the dream of one day owning a piece of land that was truly hers, where she could plant without owing anything to anyone. Arthur spoke of his passion for books, of his desire to travel to distant places he only knew from maps, and of the burden of carrying a name and an inheritance he never felt were truly his. It was during this conversation that he touched upon the subject that had been intriguing him. "Elisa, you told me your father died in a cornfield. Were those your family's lands?" "No, sir," she replied. "My father worked for others. But my grandfather, he did have a small farm. My father used to say it was a beautiful place, with good soil and a spring that never dried up. But he lost everything. I don't quite know how. A debt, a bad deal. My father was very young at the time. He didn't remember the details. He only remembered my grandfather's sadness, who died shortly after, of a broken heart." "And do you know where that farm was located?" Arthur asked, his heart beating a little faster. "My father said it was towards Highcroft, near where Colonel Beaumont's lands are today." That information was like a key. Highcroft, Colonel Beaumont's lands. The vague memory in his mind began to take shape. It was a story he had heard from his own grandfather many years ago, a story about a land dispute, about a smallholder who had been deceived by an ambitious neighbor, a neighbor named Beaumont, the current colonel's father. The sun was already high when they parted ways. The secret meeting had deepened the bond between them. It was no longer just the curiosity of a noble or the gratitude of a peasant girl. It was a mutual recognition, the discovery of two souls who, despite living in such different worlds, shared the same loneliness and the same yearnings. Returning home, Arthur knew he was no longer just curious about Elisa. He was determined to discover the truth about her family's past. He felt that her story and his were in some way intertwined by an old injustice crying out for redress. Colonel Beaumont was not a man to accept defeat. Arthur's refusal to distance himself from Elisa and the coldness with which he had treated him in his own library were affronts he would not forget. Realizing that social pressure and friendly advice were having no effect, he decided it was time to change tactics. If he couldn't control the Lord, he would control the peasant girl. And the best way to control someone like Elisa was through fear and necessity. He couldn't use direct violence. That would draw Arthur's attention and could backfire. His weapon would be more subtle, but equally devastating. The first maneuver was to spread a new rumor, far more dangerous than the previous ones. He instructed one of his henchmen to go to the village store and, in a casual conversation, comment on Elisa's mother's illness. They say it's a fever that won't pass, that leaves a person weak, wasting away, the man said, for anyone who cared to listen. The healer from my parts said that sounds a lot like consumption, that chest disease that spreads through the air. Dangerous stuff. The word consumption, tuberculosis, was synonymous with panic in those times. The mere mention of the disease was enough to turn a person into a pariah. The rumors spread through the village and fields with the speed of a plague. In a few days, Elisa felt the isolation close in around her. Neighbors who used to stop to chat now crossed the road when they saw her. At the spring, the other women moved away, leaving an empty space around her. When she went to the village to sell the few vegetables her patch of land produced, buyers became scarce. People looked at her cabbages and tomatoes with suspicion, as if the food itself could carry the disease. The financial pressure soon became unbearable. With the difficulty of selling her produce, the little money she had began to run out. Medicines for her mother, food, everything became more difficult. The malice of the rumor was cruel, for it attacked not only her social life, but her very survival. Elisa found herself cornered, anguish tightening her chest day and night. She knew, deep down, where this attack was coming from. It was Victoria's and her father's response. They were trying to break her, to force her to leave the region or to submit. Meanwhile, Arthur, immersed in his investigation, was oblivious to what was happening in the village. He spent entire days locked in the library, surrounded by ancient maps, dusty registry books, and yellowed letters. With the help of Mr. Jenkins, his faithful butler, he tried to reconstruct the history of the Highcroft lands. Jenkins, who knew the region's stories better than anyone, confirmed Arthur's suspicions. "I remember that story, my lord," the old butler said one night as he helped Arthur decipher ancient handwriting. "I was a boy, but I heard my father tell it. There was an honest smallholder, a certain Ansel Davies, Elisa's grandfather, and there was old Horace Beaumont, the colonel's father. Old Beaumont always had a greedy eye. He coveted Davies' farm because of the spring. In those days, good water was worth more than gold." Jenkins recounted that old Beaumont lent money to Elisa's grandfather at exorbitant interest rates, knowing he wouldn't be able to pay. When the debt came due, Beaumont executed the contract and took the lands. Poor Davies swore that the contract he signed wasn't the same one presented to the judge. Said old Beaumont had swapped the papers, that the original document provided for a much longer term. But he was a simple man, barely knew how to read. No one believed him against the word of a rich and influential man. He lost everything and died of a broken heart shortly after. The family scattered, became tenant farmers, sharecroppers. It was their ruin. The story left Arthur furious. The injustice was clear. Colonel Beaumont and his daughter, who presented themselves as pillars of morality and good customs, were heirs to a fortune built on the ruin of an honest family. The connection he felt with Elisa now made a deeper sense. It wasn't just an affinity of souls. It was a call of destiny to right a past wrong. It was only when he finally emerged from his isolation in the library that he learned what was happening to Elisa. One of the estate's employees, whose wife was Elisa's cousin, took courage and told the Lord about the rumor of the illness and the difficulties she was facing. The news struck Arthur like a lightning bolt. He felt guilty. While he was locked away with his books, the woman he so admired was suffering a cowardly attack because of him. His reaction was immediate. That same afternoon, he harnessed his own carriage and drove to the village. But he didn't go to Elisa's house. He stopped in front of Dr. Thompson's surgery, the only doctor in the region, an elderly and respected man who attended both rich and poor. Arthur entered the surgery and went straight to the point. "Doctor, I need you to do me a favor. I want you to go to the Davies family's cottage and examine the ailing woman. And I want you to give me a certificate, a medical report with her precise diagnosis. And I want you to post a copy of this report on the church door and the village store door for everyone to read." The doctor, surprised by the unusual request, agreed. That same afternoon, he went to Elisa's cottage. He examined her mother carefully and at the end, gave his diagnosis. It was an intermittent fever, caused by an old infection and aggravated by poor nutrition and exhaustion. There was nothing of consumption, nothing contagious. It was a disease of poverty. Not a plague. The next day, as Arthur had requested, 2 copies of the doctor's report with his stamp and signature appeared in the busiest places in the village. The effect was immediate. The rumor, disproven by the unquestionable authority of the doctor, died as quickly as it had been born. People, ashamed of their credulity and their cruelty, changed their attitude. The same neighbors who avoided her now appeared at her door with a plate of food, a piece of bread, as a silent apology. Elisa, relieved, knew whom to thank. That gesture from the Lord, so public and so direct, was not just a defense of her, but a declaration of war on Colonel Beaumont. The battle, which had previously been fought in the shadows, was now out in the open. Arthur's intervention with the medical report was a direct blow to Colonel Beaumont's pride. The maneuver not only cleared Elisa's and her mother's name, but also indirectly exposed the vile nature of those who had spread the rumor. Although no one dared accuse the colonel openly, everyone in the county knew who benefited from the Davies family's misfortune. Beaumont's reputation, once unassailable, suffered a fissure. He, who portrayed himself as a just patriarch and protector of community values, was seen as a man capable of using illness and fear to achieve his goals. While the dust of the scandal settled, Arthur continued his search for definitive proof of the fraud committed by the colonel's father. The story told by Mr. Jenkins and the indications in the registry books were strong, but he needed something concrete, a document, a witness, something he could use to confront Beaumont without leaving room for denials. The memory of Elisa's grandfather swearing that the papers had been swapped wouldn't leave his mind. Where could the original contract be? His search led him to the old county registry office, a stuffy, moldy-smelling building where piles of lawsuits and deeds had accumulated for decades. With his influence, he gained access to the oldest archives. It was days of exhaustive work, leafing through fragile, yellowed pages, the dust making him sneeze incessantly. He was looking for the record of the land transfer from Elisa's grandfather, Mr. Ansel Davies, to the colonel's father, Horace Beaumont. Finally, he found it. The process was short. It contained the loan contract with Ansel Davies' signature, a clumsy X, as was common for illiterates of the time, and the debt execution notice. Everything seemed legally correct. Arthur was about to give up when he noticed something strange. Attached to the process was a small envelope with the annotation supporting documents. Inside, there was a folded piece of paper. It was a statement from a witness to the contract's signing. A man named Ramiro, who worked as a foreman for Horace Beaumont at the time. But what caught Arthur's attention was the back of the paper. It was blank, but holding it against the light, he noticed a faint mark, an indentation. Carefully, he ran his fingertips over the mark. It looked like an impression, as if something had been written forcefully on a sheet above it. Intrigued, he took the document home. In his library, with the help of a magnifying glass and a lamp, he began to examine the paper more closely. He rubbed a little graphite powder over the marked area, and like magic, letters began to appear. It was a draft, a confession. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible, but the message was clear. It was from Ramiro, the foreman. In the text, he confessed that at Horace Beaumont's command, he had swapped the contracts. The true contract, which gave a 5-year term for debt repayment, was burned. The one presented to the judge was a forged copy, with a term of only 6 months. Ramiro, tormented by guilt, had scribbled that confession, perhaps with the intention of one day revealing the truth. But fear of his employer prevented him. He had hidden the confession in the most ingenious way possible, as a draft on the back of an official document, where no one would ever look. Arthur felt a cold triumph surge through his veins. There it was, the proof, the weapon he needed to bring justice. The old memory that had haunted him since the day of the ball had finally revealed itself completely. It wasn't just a feeling. It was the memory of a story of injustice that his soul refused to forget. His connection with Elisa was a link of destiny, forged so that he, a Blackwood, could repair the wrong a Beaumont had done to a Davies. He wasted no time. The next morning, he mounted his fastest horse and rode to Colonel Beaumont's estate. He sent no message, requested no audience. He arrived and entered, to the surprise of the servants. He found the colonel in his study, an opulent room adorned with hunting trophies and portraits of his ancestors. Victoria was with him, discussing party preparations. Arthur's abrupt arrival left them speechless. "What is the meaning of this intrusion, Arthur?" snarled the colonel, rising from his chair. "I have come to settle an old debt," Arthur said, his voice calm but cutting. He threw the paper with Ramiro's confession onto the colonel's desk. "I believe you recognize the story of how your family built its fortune." The colonel picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the shaky lines. The blood drained from his face, leaving him pale as wax. He looked from Arthur to the paper, and back to Arthur, shock and fear etched on his face. Victoria, not understanding, approached to read. "What is this, Papa?" When she read the words, a gasp escaped her lips. The arrogance that had always characterized her crumbled, replaced by a vulnerability she rarely displayed. This proves nothing," stammered the colonel, trying to regain his composure. "It's a draft, a worthless old paper." "Perhaps it has no value to a judge after so many years," Arthur agreed. "But it has immense value to public opinion. Imagine what the people of this county will say when they learn that the pillar of our society, the mayor, the man of the law, lives off the fruits of a theft. That your honor is a sham built upon the misfortune of an innocent family." The threat was clear. Arthur didn't need to go to court. He could destroy Colonel Beaumont's reputation, the most precious asset for a man in his position. The silence in the study was heavy. The colonel, defeated, sank into his chair. The empire he had striven so hard to maintain was about to crumble. He looked at Arthur, no longer with arrogance, but with the desperation of a cornered man. "What do you want, Arthur? Money? Name your price." Arthur smiled, a joyless smile. "What I want is priceless. I want justice. You will return what you stole. The lands of the Highcroft farm, with the spring, will be transferred to Elisa Davies, and you and your daughter will never trouble her again. Never again." The confrontation in Colonel Beaumont's study was a point of no return. Defeated and humiliated, with the proof of his family's dishonor in Arthur's hands, the colonel had no choice but to yield. The prospect of having his name and his father's dragged through the mud was more terrifying than the loss of a piece of land. Honor, even if false, was all he had. In the following days, discreetly, he pulled strings at the registry office. Lawyers were consulted, documents were drafted, and without fanfare, the deed to the old Highcroft farm, with its acres of fertile land and valuable spring, was transferred to Elisa Davies. Arthur did not tell Elisa immediately. He wanted everything to be formalized. He wanted to give her not a promise, but a certainty. While the legal procedures unfolded, he planned the next step. He felt that the reparation of the injustice needed to be celebrated, not with ostentation, but with dignity. and he knew exactly how to do it. He decided to host another ball, but this one would be different from the first. It would be smaller, more discreet, only for the closest neighbors and the people who truly mattered. It would be an event not to display wealth, but to celebrate truth. He himself wrote the invitation for Elisa. This time, it wasn't a simple note, but an elegant card, delivered in an envelope sealed with his family's crest. Along with the invitation, he sent a gift. He asked Mr. Jenkins to hire the best seamstress in the neighboring town and described what he wanted. A simple dress, but of noble fabric. A dress that wouldn't make her pretend to be something she wasn't, but that would enhance the beauty that already existed within her. The seamstress did a beautiful job. A dark blue silk dress, the color of the sky at dusk, with an elegant cut and no excessive embroidery or embellishments. It was the personification of sophisticated simplicity. When the messenger arrived at the cottage with the box and the invitation, Elisa was speechless. Her mother, who already felt a little stronger thanks to the medicines and better food Arthur had been discreetly sending, looked at the dress with tears in her eyes. "My daughter," she whispered, "it's beautiful. It looks like a princess's dress." Elisa felt a lump in her throat. It was all so fast, so overwhelming. She picked up the invitation and read the words. It wasn't a formal invitation, but a personal note. "Elisa, I would be honored if you would be my guest of honor at a small reception at my home. There is something I need to tell you, and if you would grant me the honor, I would like to dance the first waltz with you. With affection, Arthur." The fear and hesitation she had felt before had vanished. In their place, there was a quiet confidence. She knew she could trust him. She knew that by his side, she would be safe. On the night of the ball, she got ready with her mother's help. The blue dress fell perfectly on her body. The soft fabric, a caress on her skin, accustomed to rough linen. She pinned her hair in a simple bun, leaving a few curls loose, framing her face. She wore no jewelry, only the dignity in her gaze. When she looked in the small, cracked mirror, she saw a woman she didn't know, but who she felt was herself in her truest form. This time, she didn't walk. Arthur sent his own carriage to fetch her. The arrival at the manor house was completely different from the first time. The same footman who had treated her with disdain now opened the door with a bow, his eyes lowered. The ballroom was lit, but the atmosphere was different. There were fewer people, and the mood was one of respect and expectation. Everyone there knew that this night was special, that something important was about to happen. Victoria and her father were not invited. Their absence was noted and commented on in whispers. It was the public sign of their fall from grace. When Elisa entered, all eyes turned to her. But this time, there was no mockery or disdain. There was admiration and curiosity. She was no longer the intrusive peasant girl. She was the Lord's guest of honor. Arthur awaited her at the foot of the staircase. He wore a dark suit, and in his eyes there was a sparkle she had never seen before. He descended the last steps and stopped before her. "You look radiant, Elisa," he said, his voice filled with sincere emotion. He offered her his arm, and she accepted it. Together, they walked to the center of the ballroom. Arthur signaled to the orchestra, which remained silent. He asked for everyone's attention. His voice echoed through the ballroom, clear and firm. "My friends, thank you for coming tonight. I have called you here to celebrate justice. Many of you know the story of the Davies family, a story of hard work and, unfortunately, of a great injustice that took from them what was rightfully theirs. Tonight, I have the honor to announce that this past wrong has been corrected." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "The lands that belonged to Miss Elisa Davies' grandfather have been legally restored to her." A murmur of astonishment swept through the ballroom. It was a bombshell revelation. Elisa looked at Arthur, her eyes wide, her heart pounding. She knew nothing of this. The lands, Her grandfather's farm. Was it hers? Tears of disbelief and gratitude welled in her eyes. Arthur turned to her. "It is yours, Elisa, what it always should have been." Then, in a gesture that mirrored and at the same time inverted their first encounter, it was she who acted. Before everyone, in silence, Elisa extended her hand to him, an invitation. The entire ballroom watched, breathless. The peasant girl, now a landowner, inviting the Lord to dance. He smiled, a genuine and happy smile, and accepted her hand. The orchestra began to play a waltz, and they danced, publicly sealing not only the reparation of an injustice, but the beginning of a new story. The waltz that followed was not like the first. The previous dance at the Great Autumn Ball had been an act of defiance, a gesture of compassion that shocked and divided. This, however, was a dance of celebration, of union. As they spun across the ballroom, Elisa and Arthur needed no words. Their glances said everything. Her gratitude, his admiration, and a new, deeper feeling that both were beginning to recognize as love. Not a fairy tale love, born of a sudden enchantment, but a love built on mutual respect, admiration for each other's strength of character, and the rediscovery of their own humanity in each other's presence. The guests now applauded, not out of obligation or surprise, but with genuine enthusiasm. They witnessed something rare, the triumph of integrity over arrogance, of justice over greed. The story of the night would spread, not as a scandalous rumor, but as a local legend, a tale of how pride bowed before humility. When the music ended, Arthur led her to the veranda, away from curious gazes. The night was cool, and the full moon bathed the gardens in silver light. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice still trembling with emotion. "The lands, are they mine?" "They are yours," he confirmed, holding her hands. "I found proof that your grandfather was deceived. Colonel Beaumont had no choice but to return what should never have been his." Elisa looked towards the horizon, in the direction of Highcroft. "My mother, my father, my grandfather, they would be so happy. You have no idea what you've done for us. You've restored our dignity." "You never lost it, Elisa," he said tenderly. "You are the most dignified person I know. I merely help the world see it." He then told her the whole story, the search through the archives, the hidden confession, the confrontation with the colonel. She listened, fascinated, understanding the depth of what he had done for her. It hadn't been a whim of a rich man, but a determined search for truth. "Arthur," she began, using his first name without his title for the first time. "Why do all this for me?" He looked at her, and in his bluish-gray eyes, she saw the answer even before he spoke. "Because since I saw you, Elisa, I feel I found something I searched for my entire life without knowing. I found peace. I found a reason to believe that the world can be a just place. And I realized that I no longer want to live in this world alone. I want to live by your side." His words were a declaration, as clear and true as the moonlight above them. Elisa's heart filled with such intense happiness that it hurt. She, who had spent her life feeling invisible, was now the center of someone's universe. "I don't want to be alone anymore either," she whispered. And in those simple words was all her acceptance, all her love. In the months that followed, life in the valley changed. With Arthur's help, Elisa and her mother moved to the farm at Highcroft. The house, which had been abandoned, was renovated. The land, which had been fallow, was plowed and planted. The spring once again irrigated the fields, and life bloomed anew in that place. Elisa's mother, with the fresh country air and her daughter's happiness, regained her health and joy for life. Arthur was a constant presence. He left the manor house to spend his days with her, helping with the farm work, learning to smell the wet earth, the joy of seeing a seed sprout. He found in physical labor and the simplicity of that life the peace that ballrooms and books never gave him. And Elisa, in turn, blossomed. Confidence replaced fear, and she became the mistress of her own destiny. a strong and respected woman, not for the name she would carry, but for who she was. Their wedding was a simple ceremony, held in the small village chapel, without luxury, without ostentation. Only close friends and the workers from both their lands. Victoria and Colonel Beaumont did not appear. They said they had moved to the capital, unable to bear the humiliation of their defeat. That night, after the ceremony, Arthur and Elisa stood on the veranda of the farmhouse, looking out at the fields that rippled under the moonlight. From the valley, the distant sound of a piano reached them, perhaps from the manor house, where Mr. Jenkins, the old butler, celebrated in his own way. The sound mingled with the chirping of crickets and the rustling of the wind in the cornfield. It was the melody of two worlds that, against all odds, had become one. The memory of that night at the ball, of the flickering candles and the humiliation, seemed a lifetime ago. Here, under the stars, they had found what truly mattered: each other. So, did you enjoy how pride and humility danced this waltz? If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Leave us a like to let us know you made it this far. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our next emotional tales. And most importantly, comment below what you would do in Elisa's or Arthur's shoes. Your opinion is the special spice of our narratives. A hug, and until next time.